Picture this. It's the 1760s, and the 13 colonies of North America are a vital part of the British Empire. These lands, stretching from New Hampshire to Georgia, are thriving economically, culturally, and socially. But beneath this prosperity lies a growing unease. The colonies feel the weight of Britain's rule tightening, and a storm of rebellion is brewing. By the 1770s, the colonies had had enough. Protests turned into full-scale defiance. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 saw colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, a direct rebuke of British taxation policies. In the face of these punishments, colonial leaders came together for the First Continental Congress. They demanded their rights as Englishmen and sought reconciliation with the Crown. But war was on the horizon. June 1776. Philadelphia is alive with anticipation. Delegates from the 13 colonies gather at the Pennsylvania State House, debating the most important question in their history. Should they sever ties with Britain, the most powerful empire in the world? Thomas Jefferson was just 33 years old when he was tasked with drafting the Declaration. His selection was no accident. Jefferson was known for his eloquence and his ability to distill complex ideas into clear, powerful language. Jefferson's words carried a simple yet profound message. Governments exist to serve their people, not the other way around. And when a government becomes destructive to these rights, the people have the authority to overthrow it. The draft sparked intense debate. Some delegates feared declaring independence would provoke harsher retaliation from Britain. Others worried about alienating loyalists, colonists who still supported the Crown. Meanwhile, the Continental Army under George Washington moved northward. In late November, Washington established winter quarters at Newburgh, New York, in what would be the Army's final encampment. Across the fortifications, British and American forces stared at one another in a prolonged, uneasy silence. The two armies would never engage in a full-scale campaign again. Yet the end of large-scale fighting did not mean true peace. Sporadic clashes broke out between British patrols and American militia. Skirmishes flared between Patriot forces and Loyalist holdouts, igniting localized conflicts that kept the tension alive. While the war's conclusion seemed inevitable, this uneasy stalemate in the East symbolized the slow and arduous process of winding down a war that had consumed both sides for years. As winter descended on the Eastern Front, the focus of the revolution began to shift westward, where another war, the Frontier War, was far from over. While the major battles of the American Revolution subsided in the East, the war on the frontier raged on with relentless intensity. In the vast, untamed lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, the conflict took on a different character, one defined by raids, ambushes, and the fight for survival in remote settlements. The British, determined to maintain control over their western territories, devised an ambitious plan to isolate American forces in the region. From their stronghold in Detroit, they sought to rally Native American allies to their cause. Shawnee, Wyandot, and other tribes were recruited to carry out a series of coordinated attacks designed to destabilize the frontier. Their plan aimed to cut off Vincennes, retake Spanish-controlled Louisiana, and reclaim key posts along the Mississippi River. But the strategy faltered before it could truly begin. Spanish forces, led by Bernardo de Galvez, had already overrun much of West Florida in 1779, shattering British ambitions in the South. Meanwhile, attacks on St. Louis and Cahokia failed to breach their defenses, and Captain Henry Byrd's expedition into Kentucky, though destructive, fell short of its objectives. Supplies ran low, and British forces were forced to withdraw, leaving American settlers shaken but resolute. In the summer of 1782, a campaign of vengeance unfolded in the Ohio Valley. Virginia Brigadier General George Rogers Clark, already a legend on the frontier, organized a militia force of 1,000 men to punish the Shawnee for their alliance with the British. His target was Piqua, the Shawnees' main settlement and a critical military base with fortifications and expansive fields of crops. On August 8th, Clark's forces reached Piqua, finding the Shawnee prepared to stand and fight. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Shawnee warriors, led by British agent Simon Girty, took defensive positions behind breastworks and in the fortified blockhouse, hoping to repel the American advance. Clark's strategy was bold. He divided his force into 3 groups, attacking from multiple directions to overwhelm the defenders. Despite their preparation, the Shawnee were caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault. Clark's artillery bombarded the blockhouse, collapsing its defenses and forcing the Shawnee to flee. By the end of the battle, Piqua was in ruins, its fields burned, its buildings destroyed, and its people scattered. While Clark reported only 27 casualties, historians suspect the true toll was much higher. The destruction of Piqua marked a turning point, but didn't end the violence. The frontier descended into chaos during what became known as the Year of Blood. Allied tribes launched devastating raids across Kentucky, burning settlements and driving settlers into fortified towns like Lexington. Retaliatory expeditions by American militias were often ambushed, resulting in heavy losses. Caught in the crossfire were pacifist Moravian Christian Lenape communities who were mistrusted by both sides. In March 1782, a Pennsylvania militia, frustrated by the ongoing raids, massacred 96 Christian Lenape at Gnadenhutten, bludgeoning them to death as they prayed. This atrocity, condemned even by the Continental Congress, only fueled the cycle of violence. By the end of 1782, however, the frontier war began to wane. British support dwindled as resources were redirected to defend their Caribbean colonies. Without British backing, Native American tribes struggled to sustain their campaigns. Clark's forces continued to burn Shawnee villages, further weakening their ability to resist. Though the frontier quieted, peace remained elusive, and tensions would reignite in the years to come. As the conflict on the American mainland drew toward its conclusion, the war shifted focus to the Caribbean, a region rich in resources and vital to European empires. For Britain, retaining its Caribbean colonies, particularly Jamaica, was paramount. Jamaica's sugar plantations generated immense wealth, far surpassing the economic output of the 13 colonies. Meanwhile, France and Spain, emboldened by their victories at Yorktown, saw an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to British dominance in the region. By late 1781, the French and Spanish had devised a grand strategy: the capture of Jamaica. Both Comte de Grasse, commanding the French fleet, and Spanish governor Bernardo de Galvez understood that such a conquest would cripple Britain economically and strengthen their own positions in the Americas. Yet Jamaica's formidable defenses posed a challenge. To succeed, the Allies planned to isolate the island by first capturing surrounding territories, including the Windward Islands and St. Lucia, Augustine. The campaign began with a series of swift victories. In January 1782, de Grasse's forces captured several smaller islands and laid siege to St. Kitts. By February, the British garrison there surrendered, giving France a strategic foothold in the region. Spain, meanwhile, launched its own offensives, capturing the Bahamas and preparing to join the French in a coordinated assault on Jamaica. However, Britain was not ready to concede its Caribbean stronghold. Admiral George Rodney, commanding the British fleet from St. Lucia, knew that losing Jamaica would be disastrous. Personally facing financial ruin and eager to redeem his reputation, Rodney mobilized his fleet to intercept de Grasse. On April 9, 1782, the British caught the French fleet near the Saint Passage, marking the beginning of one of the war's most consequential naval battles. Over the next 3 days, the two sides maneuvered for advantage. Then, on April 12th, the winds shifted in Rodney's favor. Seizing the opportunity, he executed a bold maneuver, cutting through the French battle line and dividing their fleet into disarray. The result was a decisive British victory. 5 French ships, including de Grasse's flagship, were captured and many others were heavily damaged. De Grasse himself was taken prisoner, dealing a severe blow to French morale and halting the Allied advance on Jamaica. Rodney's triumph not only secured Britain's control over the Caribbean, but also reinforced its bargaining position in the peace negotiations that followed. The defeat at the Saint forced France and Spain to abandon their plans for Jamaica. Without de Grasse's leadership and with their fleets battered, the Allies turned to defensive strategies. Disease ravaged Spanish troops, further undermining their ability to launch offensives. By the summer of 1782, the Caribbean campaign had largely ground to a halt. For Spain, the failure to capture Jamaica was a bitter disappointment, but their ambitions remained focused elsewhere. The siege of Gibraltar, which had dragged on for years, became their priority. France, meanwhile, was increasingly eager to end the war altogether. Financial pressures in Versailles and the Saint disaster made prolonging the conflict untenable. While the Caribbean theater did not result in the sweeping victories France and Spain had hoped for, it underscored the global scale of the American Revolution. The outcome of these campaigns not only influenced the eventual peace terms, but also marked the waning moments of a war that had engulfed multiple continents. The news of Yorktown hit Britain like a thunderclap. On November 25, 1781, Prime Minister Frederick North reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." The surrender of Cornwallis shattered the illusion that the rebellion in the American colonies could be suppressed. Yet, even as the war's conclusion seemed inevitable, political chaos erupted in London, with factions vying for control of Britain's future. In the months following Yorktown, Lord North's government struggled to maintain its grip. The Prime Minister, already battered by years of war and rising public discontent, faced mounting pressure from the opposition Whigs. Led by figures like Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke, the Whigs seized on Yorktown as evidence of the Tories' failed policies and called for immediate peace with America. North attempted to stave off political collapse by proclaiming that British forces in North America would remain intact, though offensive operations were suspended. This promise allowed the budget to pass in early 1782, but it was a temporary reprieve. Each successive blow, including naval defeats in the Caribbean and minor colonial losses, further weakened his position. In February 1782, North sacrificed one of his closest allies, Secretary of State George Germain, offering his resignation in exchange for a peerage. But the gesture came too late. On February 27th, Parliament voted to end further offensive actions in America, effectively signaling the end of the war. 2 weeks later, on March 20th, North submitted his resignation to King George III. The king, who had steadfastly supported the war, reluctantly accepted, marking the end of North's 12-year tenure. With North's resignation, the Whigs took control under the leadership of Charles Watson Wentworth, the Marquis of Rockingham. Rockingham's government was determined to negotiate peace, but internal divisions within the Whig Party soon complicated matters. The party split between Rockingham's faction, which prioritized reconciliation with America, and another led by Lord Shelburne, who sought to preserve Britain's empire at all costs. When Rockingham unexpectedly died on July 1, 1782, Shelburne assumed the role of Prime Minister. His ascension deepened the rift within the Whigs, creating an unstable government at a time when steady leadership was desperately needed. Shelburne's strategy focused on negotiating favorable terms with the United States, even if it meant alienating Britain's European allies. While political upheaval consumed Britain, the groundwork for peace talks was already underway. Shelburne secretly reached out to George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, indicating that Britain was prepared to recognize American independence as a precondition for negotiations. This maneuver, though hidden from Parliament, marked a pivotal shift in British policy. Despite these overtures, Shelburne faced resistance from his own party and the broader political establishment. Many in Britain, including members of the king's inner circle, clung to the hope of retaining at least some of the colonies or extracting concessions from the Americans. Shelburne's duplicity in handling the negotiations also sparked outrage among Whig leaders, further destabilizing his fragile coalition. By late 1782, political and military realities had forced Britain's hand. With mounting defeats, rising war debts, and the loss of public support, even the staunchest imperialists acknowledged that the war was lost. The stage was set for the Treaty of Paris, which would formally end the conflict and reshape the British Empire.
By late 1782, the wheels of diplomacy began turning in earnest. The British, exhausted from years of war and political infighting, were now eager to finalize peace. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams represented the United States in Paris, navigating a complex web of negotiations that would ultimately reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Americas.
For Franklin and his fellow diplomats, the primary objective was clear: secure recognition of American independence as an unquestionable precondition for peace. This was no small demand. Although Britain was ready to negotiate, some in Parliament still clung to the hope of retaining parts of the colonies or exacting economic concessions in return for independence. Franklin, however, was resolute. In April 1782, Shelburne privately communicated Britain's willingness to accept American independence, a decision that marked a significant turning point. With this concession in hand, Franklin and his team sought to expand their demands, including territorial claims that stretched as far as the Mississippi River. At the same time, they worked to sideline France, whose interests often conflicted with those of the Americans. France, under the leadership of Comte de Vergennes, had been America's staunchest ally throughout the war. Yet as peace negotiations progressed, Franklin grew wary of French intentions. Vergennes and Spain's Charles III both sought to limit American territorial ambitions, fearing that a powerful, independent United States could threaten their colonial holdings. Spain, in particular, proposed a border at the Appalachian Mountains, which would confine the United States to the eastern seaboard. This plan also called for much of the Ohio Valley to remain under British control, with the Mississippi River serving as a boundary between Spanish Louisiana and American territory. France, meanwhile, hoped to claim exclusive fishing rights in Newfoundland and retain influence over the Gulf of Mexico. Franklin understood the delicate balance required to navigate these competing interests. He moved quickly to negotiate directly with Britain, bypassing Vergennes and effectively breaking the Franco-American Treaty's Joint Negotiation Clause. This bold move allowed the Americans to dictate terms without interference from their European allies. The preliminary agreement, signed on November 30th, 1782, represented a triumph for American diplomacy. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States with generous territorial boundaries that included land stretching to the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and the northern border of Florida. In addition, fishing rights. American fishermen secured the right to fish in Newfoundland, a crucial economic boon for the fledgling nation. Loyalist compensation. Britain requested compensation for loyalists whose properties had been seized during the war. Congress agreed to recommend this to the states, though in practice, little was done. Navigation rights. Both nations gained navigation rights along the Mississippi River, ensuring access to critical trade routes. Crucially, the treaty did not account for the indigenous tribes who inhabited much of the land being transferred. Their ancestral territories were divided up without consultation, laying the groundwork for future conflicts as American settlers pushed westward. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, marking the official end of the American Revolution. For Britain, it was a bitter pill to swallow, symbolizing the loss of its most valuable colonies. For America, it was a moment of triumph, but also the beginning of immense challenges. The newly independent nation faced the daunting tasks of unifying its states, governing its people, and establishing its place on the world stage. Though the treaty ended the war, it left behind unresolved tensions. Britain retained a presence in Canada, and disputes over the western frontier would simmer for decades. Meanwhile, France and Spain, though allies in the conflict, emerged from the war with their own financial and political wounds. The Treaty of Paris did more than end the American Revolution. It redefined power dynamics across the Atlantic and heralded the rise of a new, independent nation. As the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris, the final remnants of the American Revolution played out on the ground. For the men and women who had endured years of war, the transition to peace was far from seamless. British forces began their evacuation, Loyalists fled for safety, and George Washington prepared for a historic farewell. These moments marked the true end of the Revolution and the beginning of the American experiment. The British evacuation unfolded in stages, starting in the southern colonies. Savannah was abandoned in July 1782, and Charleston followed in December. However, New York City, the heart of British operations in North America, remained under their control for nearly another year. It became a chaotic hub of Loyalist refugees, escaped slaves seeking freedom, and British troops preparing to depart. General Guy Carleton, now in command of British forces, worked tirelessly to coordinate the evacuation. Washington, ever the strategist, pressed Carleton for a clear timeline while negotiating the release of American prisoners. One particularly contentious issue was the fate of thousands of escaped slaves who had sought sanctuary with the British. Carleton refused to return them, arguing that doing so would violate Britain's promise of freedom. By November 1783, most British troops and Loyalists had departed for Canada or the Caribbean, leaving behind a transformed city. On November 25, 1783, Evacuation Day, Washington and his Continental Army triumphantly entered Manhattan, reclaiming the city that had been a British stronghold since 1776. The streets were lined with jubilant crowds celebrating the end of British occupation. For many, this moment symbolized the Revolution's ultimate victory. With the war officially over, Washington faced one final task as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army: stepping down. On December 23, 1783, in Annapolis, Maryland, Washington appeared before the Continental Congress to resign his commission. His words were brief but poignant, reflecting his deep respect for civilian authority. "I consider it an indispensable duty," Washington declared, "to close this last solemn act of my official life and to commend the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God." This act of resignation was unprecedented. In an era when victorious generals often seized power, Washington's voluntary return to civilian life stunned the world. King George III reportedly remarked that if Washington gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. Washington's resignation set a vital precedent for the fledgling republic. The military would remain subservient to civilian government. It also marked the beginning of Washington's brief retirement at Mount Vernon, though the nation would call him back to service just a few years later as its first president. The American Revolution had officially come to an end, but its impact was just beginning to be felt. A new nation, born out of rebellion, now faced the daunting challenge of governance. The Articles of Confederation provided a loose framework for the United States, but the weaknesses of this system would soon become apparent. Meanwhile, the Revolution reverberated far beyond America's borders. Inspired by the ideals of liberty and self-governance, revolutionary movements began to stir in France and Latin America. Yet the revolution also left a trail of unresolved issues: the displacement of indigenous tribes, the plight of Loyalists forced into exile, and the future of slavery in a nation founded on freedom. As Washington rode home to Mount Vernon, the Revolution's greatest promise remained unfulfilled: the creation of a united, thriving republic. What lay ahead would test the resilience and vision of the new nation, but for now, the long and bloody struggle for independence was over. The American Revolution was far more than a colonial uprising. It was a profound reimagining of governance, freedom, and national identity. The road to independence, marked by victories and defeats, diplomacy and betrayal, culminated in the Treaty of Paris, yet the end of the war was only the beginning of America's story. The triumph at Yorktown symbolized the resilience and determination of the revolutionaries, but it also highlighted the critical role of international alliances and the shifting dynamics of global empires. France, Spain, and even Britain exited the war, forever changed, their power and priorities reshaped by the conflict. The fledgling United States emerged victorious, yet burdened by immense challenges. The ideal of a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal stood in stark contrast to the realities of slavery, displaced indigenous peoples, and political divisions. The Revolution's promise would require generations of struggle to fulfill. Yet in 1783, as the last British ships departed New York and George Washington returned to civilian life, the dream of self-governance stood on the brink of realization. The Revolution ignited a spark that would inspire countless others across the globe, proving that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged. As history unfolded, the legacy of the Revolution became a foundation for American identity, a reminder of what is possible when courage, sacrifice, and vision converge. The war may have ended, but the spirit of 1776 endured, a testament to the enduring pursuit of liberty. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the final years of the American Revolution. History comes alive when we explore the stories, struggles, and triumphs that shape the world we live in today. If you enjoyed traveling back in time with us, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Global Time Travelers for more epic explorations of the past. Want to stay ahead of our next adventure? Click the bell icon so you're always notified when we uncover another chapter of history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story resonated most with you? Or let us know where you'd like us to journey next. Thank you for being a part of our time-traveling community. Until our next expedition, stay curious, stay adventurous, and keep exploring the stories that make us who we are. See you in the next video.